The yellow house at the end of Crestwood Avenue had always blended into the background. It was small, with peeling paint and a lawn that grew wild each summer, but nothing about it had ever seemed unusual. That changed on a warm spring afternoon when neighbors began complaining of a foul smell drifting through the street. At first, many thought it was a dead animal caught somewhere in the yard. But as the days went on, the stench grew worse, strong enough to seep through open windows and force people to keep their doors shut. Calls were made to the authorities, and a pair of officers arrived to investigate what seemed at first like a simple nuisance complaint. They had no idea they were about to uncover something horrifying. When the officers entered the house, they were met with an unsettling stillness. The interior was cluttered, boxes stacked against walls, clothes tossed across chairs, and dishes left untouched in the sink. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle, only the stale air of a place that hadn't been lived in for days. As they made their way through the dim rooms, the smell grew stronger, guiding them toward the basement door. Each step down the narrow staircase brought a heavier wave of decay, and by the time they reached the concrete floor below, the odor was unbearable. Behind a stack of broken furniture and old storage bins, one of the officers noticed something unusual. A sheet, stained and bunched tightly, was pressed against the wall as though it had been hastily hidden. When they pulled it back, their flashlights revealed the outline of a human body. Inside was the badly decomposed remains of a woman later identified as 34-year-old Mindi Kassotis. She had been wrapped with deliberate care, almost as if the killer had tried to conceal the act rather than simply discard the evidence. Her face was barely recognizable, but the condition of her skull told investigators what they needed to know. She had suffered blunt force trauma, and her death was no accident. The news spread quickly through Crestwood Avenue, shocking residents who had known Mindi only as the quiet woman who kept mostly to herself. To them, she was a fleeting presence, someone who offered a polite smile during her morning walks and then vanished back into her solitary world. The discovery of her body in such a brutal state felt impossible in their safe suburban community. Crowds gathered near the police tape, whispering theories and watching as detectives and forensic teams carried boxes of evidence out of the home. Inside the basement, investigators worked carefully, photographing every detail. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty jars, old tools, and boxes of papers. There was no blood spatter, no obvious weapon, nothing to suggest a violent struggle had taken place in the room. This raised troubling questions. Had Mindi been killed somewhere else and brought here? Had she known her killer well enough to allow them inside without hesitation? The answers were unclear, but the way her body was hidden suggested someone familiar with the house and comfortable enough to take their time. For the detectives on scene, the gruesome discovery was only the beginning. They didn't just have a murder to solve, they had a puzzle of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Mindi Kassotis was no longer the quiet neighbor everyone thought she was. Her death marked the start of a case that would grow stranger with every clue, a story far darker than anyone on Crestwood Avenue could have imagined. At first, investigators believed the murder of Mindi Kassotis might be the result of a burglary gone wrong. But as they began to dig into her life, the theory quickly fell apart. Mindi had no signs of forced entry at her home, and nothing valuable appeared to be missing. Her small jewelry box sat untouched, cash was still in her wallet, and her car keys were resting neatly on the kitchen counter. Instead of clues pointing outward, the answer seemed to lie in her own life, one that was much more complicated than anyone had suspected. On the surface, Mindi appeared to be ordinary. She was 34, unmarried, and lived quietly in her rented home. Her job at the local bookstore was modest, and she had a reputation for being polite but private. Co-workers described her as reserved, rarely talking about her personal life. Neighbors knew even less, only that she sometimes jogged early in the mornings and kept to herself otherwise. But as police searched her home in more detail, the image of a simple, quiet woman quickly began to unravel. Every room in her house contained stacks of notebooks, piles of letters, and boxes filled with photographs. Some of the journals contained fragments of her daily thoughts, but others were stranger. Lists of names, addresses, and phone numbers with no explanation for why she had them. Entire pages were dedicated to schedules of people she knew, from coworkers to acquaintances, written in a way that suggested careful observation. Tucked into drawers were envelopes stuffed with cash and receipts for expensive purchases she could not possibly afford on her part-time income. Even more disturbing were her bank records. Large transfers appeared regularly, some from accounts that had no listed origin. Investigators discovered several prepaid debit cards and multiple checkbooks under different names. It became clear that Mindi was not just living as herself. She had built alternate identities, each with a history and purpose, though no one could determine how far these lives extended or what she used them for. Neighbors recalled seeing unfamiliar visitors at odd hours. Delivery trucks stopped at her home several times a week, leaving packages that Mindi often carried quickly inside. When questioned, some admitted they had suspected she was involved in something unusual, though no one had imagined murder would be the result. Friends from her bookstore job were shocked to learn of her secret world, as she had never hinted at anything beyond her quiet routine of reading, writing, and work. What puzzled detectives most was the duality of her life. Outwardly, she maintained the appearance of normalcy, but behind closed doors she seemed to be constructing something much darker and far-reaching. Whether she was a skilled manipulator or someone caught in circumstances beyond her control remained uncertain. The more investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Mindi had carefully built walls around her real identity, hiding her intentions even from those closest to her. Her murder was no longer simply about violence. It was now tangled with deception, money, and secrets that reached far beyond the little house on Crestwood Avenue. The discovery of her double life shifted the investigation into dangerous territory. Whoever killed her might not have been motivated by anger alone. They could have been silencing her for reasons yet to be uncovered. The investigation into Mindi Kassotis' life took a darker turn when detectives began to map the connections between her many false identities. Each alias came with its own fabricated history, complete with emails, photographs, and even forged documents. One identity presented her as a freelance travel writer, another as a grief counselor offering comfort to those who had lost loved ones, while yet another portrayed her as a photographer seeking clients for intimate portrait sessions. None of these roles tied back to her real life, but each brought her into contact with strangers who trusted her completely. It became clear that she had perfected the art of deception, crafting lives that seemed real enough to fool almost anyone. Investigators discovered that Mindi used these identities not only to build relationships but also to exploit them. Some victims described being persuaded to send her money for personal crises that never existed. Others revealed that she had collected sensitive information, promising services or emotional support that she never delivered. In one case, a grieving parent had shared private details about their child, believing Mindi was a counselor, only to later realize that her credentials were entirely fabricated. The betrayal left scars, and detectives began to wonder how many more people she had manipulated without their knowledge. The journals taken from her home revealed a pattern of calculated behavior. Entire pages documented conversations with people under different names, with notes about what worked to gain their trust and what failed. She treated her interactions like experiments, learning from mistakes and improving her tactics over time. One chilling entry described her fear that someone had discovered her lies, a shadowy figure who seemed to follow her movements. The entry ended abruptly, with no conclusion, leaving investigators to wonder if that very person was the one who ended her life. What struck detectives most was the sense of control Mindi seemed to crave. Through her web of falsehoods, she positioned herself at the center of multiple lives, each orbiting around the role she chose to play. But that control also made her vulnerable. People she deceived were not just strangers. They were individuals who trusted her with their money, their secrets, and sometimes even their grief. When the truth began to unravel, resentment would have been inevitable. For every identity she created, there was someone who might have felt betrayed, humiliated, or ruined. The scale of her deception raised difficult questions. Was she driven by greed, by the thrill of manipulation, or by something deeper and more psychological? Friends who were questioned during the investigation admitted she had always been private, but none could reconcile the quiet, polite woman they knew with the manipulative figure revealed in the evidence. To them, she had been ordinary, even forgettable. To those she deceived, she was someone entirely different, someone who seemed trustworthy until the mask slipped. The discovery of these false lives widened the suspect pool dramatically. Any one of the dozens of people she tricked could have reached a breaking point. And yet the journals hinted at something more personal, a threat that seemed close and pressing. If Mindy had known her life was in danger, it raised another troubling possibility, that her murder had not been spontaneous rage but a deliberate act carried out by someone who had watched her carefully and waited for the right moment. As detectives traced the web of deception Mindi Kassotis had spun, one name surfaced more often than any other: Caleb Farad. He was a handyman in the neighborhood, a man who kept mostly to himself but was occasionally seen fixing fences or mowing lawns for extra cash. On the surface, he seemed harmless, awkward in conversation, sometimes withdrawn but never threatening. Yet when investigators pulled records of Mindy's phone calls, online interactions, and bank transfers, Caleb's name and contact information were scattered throughout. It was not just a casual connection. Their link appeared deliberate and frequent, enough to raise suspicion that he had played a larger role in her hidden life than anyone had realized. Forensic evidence began to tie him more directly to the crime scene. His fingerprints were recovered on boxes in the basement, and fibers from his clothing were matched to the sheet used to wrap Mindy's body. He had no reason to be in her home, yet his DNA appeared in several locations, suggesting he had been there not once, but multiple times. When questioned, Caleb admitted to knowing Mindy, but his version of events painted him as another victim of her lies. He claimed she had manipulated him through one of her false identities, convincing him she was someone else entirely before eventually revealing the truth. According to him, that revelation left him humiliated and enraged, feelings that detectives believed could easily have escalated into violence. But even with this damning evidence, the case was not as straightforward as it seemed. Investigators uncovered disturbing inconsistencies in Caleb's story. He spoke of discovering Mindy's lies only recently, yet records showed he had continued contacting her under different names long after that supposed discovery. His online accounts contained threatening messages directed toward her, though he insisted they were written in anger and never meant to be acted upon. Some investigators were convinced he had simply lost control, lashing out in a fit of betrayal. Others argued the killing felt too calculated to be an act of sudden rage. As more of Caleb's history came into focus, the narrative grew even murkier. He had a past filled with instability, short-term jobs, failed relationships, and a reputation for unpredictable behavior. Neighbors recalled incidents where he became aggressive over minor disagreements, though none had imagined him capable of murder. Yet what unsettled investigators most was not his instability, but the possibility that Caleb was not acting alone. Mindy's life had intersected with too many people who had reasons to resent her. Several individuals she had deceived were found to have confronted her in the months before her death, and at least two of them had exchanged heated messages with her online. The possibility that Caleb had been manipulated or even framed could not be ignored. Was he the one who struck the fatal blow, or had someone else orchestrated the crime and allowed him to take the fall? The sheet-wrapped body, the careful placement in the basement, and the absence of a weapon all hinted at planning rather than impulse. If Caleb had indeed killed Mindy, had he done it on his own terms, or was he just the most convenient suspect for someone else's design? The community followed the investigation closely, shocked that someone so familiar, a man they passed on the street, could be linked to such a grisly crime. Yet behind the scenes, detectives remained cautious. Evidence pointed toward Caleb, but the deeper they looked into Mindy's secret world, the more they realized her death might not be explained by a single act of betrayal. It was possible she had been ensnared in a larger, more dangerous game, one in which Caleb was only one of many players. The courtroom where Caleb Varon stood trial became the stage for a story that seemed too twisted to be true. Journalists filled every seat, eager to report on the bizarre double life of Mindi Kassotis and the man accused of ending it. The prosecutors painted Caleb as a bitter figure lured into Mindy's orbit by her fabrications and then cast aside once he discovered the truth. They argued that humiliation had boiled into rage, driving him to strike her down and hide her body in the very basement where her lies had been built. To the jury, it sounded plausible, almost inevitable. But the defense offered a narrative just as compelling, one that cast doubt on every assumption. The defense pointed to Mindy's hidden world of manipulation, showing the jury stacks of her journals and lists of victims. They argued that Caleb was only one among many who had been deceived and that others had stronger reasons to want her gone. Witnesses testified to the financial and emotional harm Mindy had caused, describing themselves as broken, humiliated, and betrayed. One woman revealed she had lost her savings after believing in one of Mindy's fabricated crises. Another spoke of the devastation of confiding in Mindy as a supposed counselor, only to learn it had all been a performance. The sheer number of people who felt harmed by her left the jury questioning whether Caleb could truly be the only suspect. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the forensic evidence. Fingerprints, fibers, and DNA did not lie, they insisted. Caleb's presence in the basement could not be explained away as coincidence, nor could the threatening messages found on his accounts. But even this evidence raised uncomfortable questions. Some fibers appeared to have been planted, discovered in locations where Caleb's access seemed unlikely. Shoo. And the timing of the digital messages suggested they could have been manipulated to create a trail pointing directly to him. It became difficult to separate fact from fabrication, especially given Mindy's skill at deception. Quote, if she could create entire lives out of nothing, it was not impossible to imagine someone else staging evidence to mislead investigators.